My name is Brian Birch, and I am the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs here at UVU. But more importantly for this occasion, I also have the opportunity of teaching in the Religious Studies and Philosophy programs here at the university. And we are delighted to have a stellar group of scholars and journalists and thinkers here today to discuss what has affectionately been called the Mormon moment. But if there's one thing that life at a university teaches you, or one thing that life in general teaches you, it's to expect the unexpected. And the events of the last few days are no exception here. Some of you may have heard that there was a very minor announcement that came out of the Vatican on Monday morning that has since gripped the nation's attention. And of course, I'm referring to the announcement of the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. Being a religion reporter for the New York Times, Laurie Goodstein, our featured speaker here today, was immediately assigned to this story by her editors and was not able to make the trip to Utah. And we just found this out a day or so ago. But in good Utah Valley University fashion, we decided to soldier on, and we believe that we have a stellar set of events here today, and we're delighted to have President Matthew Holland be part of the events as well. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the sponsors and supporters of the event today, the Associated Students of Utah Valley University, the Religious Studies Program, the Honors Program, the Center for the Study of Ethics, and the Center for Global and Intercultural Engagement. All of these groups on campus work in the New York Times Readership Program, which has really been a remarkable effort to bring more awareness of current events to our students, both in the classroom and through events like this. So many thanks to my colleagues there. In a June 2011 Newsweek cover story, the title on the cover of the magazine was called "The Mormon Moment." And though the word had been used before, this was a particularly important story that Newsweek did. And many of you recall the image on the cover of the magazine. It had the advertising poster to the Book of Mormon musical, but instead of the fresh-faced young missionary, they had Mitt Romney's head superimposed on the cover. I thought that was a wonderful image and a very interesting visual representation of this phenomenon that we've called the Mormon moment. It's a confluence of journalism, academic study, popular culture, media representations. There have been all kinds of discussions going on about Mormonism in light of a variety of events, most notably the presidential campaign of Mitt Romney, but the success of the Book of Mormon musical, representations of Mormonism in television shows such as HBO's Big Love, South Park episodes, a variety of representations that really help us to get a peek into the ways in which Mormonism is both becoming more of a mainstream culture and Christian denomination, but also ways in which Mormonism creates curiosity and fascination, lampooning, and in many respects, continued misunderstanding. But some notable things that have happened include the fact that we had two Latter-day Saint presidential candidates this last time around. And what makes this even more interesting is that Mitt Romney and Jon Huntsman have a slightly different angle of vision in how they approach their Mormonism, with Romney being the traditional stalwart and devout member, while Jon Huntsman gave a much more muted presentation of himself in terms of his level of devotion to the church. That created a tremendous amount of discussion about what it means to be a Mormon, the diversity within Mormonism, and perhaps breaking down some of the stereotypes that have been placed on Mormons, as you saw from the Colbert Report clip. Another thing that's of note, I think, is that with regard to the question of the Christianness of Mormonism, the famous image, or one of them, was of Mitt Romney sitting next to Billy Graham, in which Mitt Romney received as close as an official endorsement from Billy Graham as you can possibly get. And at that very same time, Mormonism was removed from the list of religious groups labeled as cults. And so, further evidence of the way in which Mormons are entering the mainstream, despite the ongoing reservations, as you saw from the statistic that Stephen Colbert held up from the Pew survey. Another thing that you might want to note is that the Pew Forum on Religion in Public Life published a 120-page study in January of last year entitled Mormons in America. And what's of interest to me is the subtitle of the study. It's called Certain of Their Beliefs, Uncertain of Their Place in Society. And the statistics in this study really bear out the ways in which Mormons continue to show tremendous devotion to their religion relative to other religious groups, but also the continuing misperceptions on the part of outsiders, but also the continued anxiety on the part of Latter-day Saints in terms of how they are understood and viewed by the wider mainstream culture. And so in light of those facts, we decided to assemble some wonderful presenters. There have been other events dealing with the Mormon moment, but this really represents a kind of watershed discussion, I think, in terms of the aftermath of the campaign. So, as I said, we'll proceed to the panel. I will introduce each speaker briefly. I'll invite all of them to come up and take their seats at the table, and then we will be delighted to hear from President Matthew Holland first. So I will introduce them in the order they're going to speak. Matthew Holland currently serves as the 6th president of Utah Valley University. A graduate of Duke University with a PhD in political science, President Holland was awarded the James Madison Fellowship from Princeton University and the Raoul Wallenberg Scholarship for Graduate Study at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Prior to his appointment in Brigham Young University's Political Science Department, he served as Special Assistant to then Governor Michael Leavitt and as the Chief of Staff to the top executive at the Monitor Group, a well-known international consulting firm. His well-known book, Bonds of Affection, was published by Georgetown University Press, and his most recent work is a co-edited volume entitled Benjamin Franklin's Intellectual World. And I just want to express, again, heartfelt thanks to you, President, for being willing to be involved in the events here today. Second up will be Peggy Fletcher Stack. Peggy is a religion writer for the Salt Lake Tribune and has been so for the last 22 years, I believe. Peggy, you said. Wonderful career there. She is a widely consulted source for journalists covering the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And she is a real force behind the newspaper's award-winning Faith section. Her stories and contributions in the following Faith blog are continued to be viewed nationally, and many of her stories are run on national wire services. She is the co-author of the book A World of Faith and the former editor for Sunstone Magazine. And Peggy, we're delighted to have you here and appreciate you coming down in a very busy week for religion reporters. Third is Christine Haglund. Christine is the editor of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, a publication where Christine and I have worked together for the past several years. She's a frequent commentator on Mormon online discussions and is currently a contributor to the By Common Consent blog. And she has been a guest panelist at Columbia University, the University of Southern California, Wesley Theological Seminary, has appeared on C-SPAN and other public fora dealing with issues of Mormonism in public life. She is one of the pioneers in what is affectionately known as the Mormon blogosphere. And she was a contributor at Times and Seasons prior to her moving to By Common Consent. She received her master's degree from the University of Michigan in German literature, and Christine, we're delighted to have you here. Thank you for coming. Fourth is Russell Arben Fox. Russell is an associate professor of political science at Friends University in Wichita, Kansas, and he specializes in American government, comparative politics, social philosophy, and political theology. He received a PhD in politics from Catholic University of America, and he did that after studying international and area studies at Brigham Young University. He has contributed to the New York Times Room for Debate section, and currently serves as the book review editor for Dialogue. Russell, thank you for coming and joining us. And last but not least is Dr. Jim Faulkner. Jim is a professor of philosophy at BYU and is the Richard L. Evans Professor of Religious Understanding there. And as many of you know, that's a very prestigious position to hold in terms of cultivating relations and dialogue across religious traditions. He is a columnist for the Mormon panel at Patheos and is a frequent contributor himself to online discussions and forums on religion and culture. He received his bachelor's degree in English from BYU and his master's degree and PhD in philosophy from Pennsylvania State University. He is the author of Faith, Philosophy, and Scripture, Transcendence in Philosophy of Religion, and Appropriating Heidegger, among other more recent works that he's published. I'm a big admirer of Jim's. Thank you again. So please join me in welcoming the panelists, and we'll start with President Holland.
Good morning and welcome to Utah Valley University. It's a pleasure to have all of you here as our guests today, and a real treat and honor for me to be part of this distinguished panel, even if I am something of a pinch hitter for our esteemed colleague from the New York Times. I won't try to do this in some East Coast accent. You just got me today. So I want to commend Dr. Brian Birch for doing what he always does, which is assemble a very diverse and interesting set of folks to come together and talk about timely issues of real relevance, and I think he's done that yet again. I also have to say I think it's particularly fitting that UVU is hosting this particular event, given that right now we are heading into what appears to be a fairly significant budget shortfall due to the announcement of the LDS Church on missionary age change. So we are having our own Mormon moment as we speak, and we hope we survive it. As we gather to discuss the so-called Mormon moment in American public and cultural life, what it is and what its long-term impact may have on the future, I find myself groping for the cover of that figure who always comes to mind with all things Americana. I mean, of course, Leon Trotsky. As his famed biographer Isaac Deutscher once put it, proof of Trotsky's farsightedness is that none of his predictions have come true yet. With hopes I can be half that prescient, I'll plunge ahead. While much has been made of the Mormon moment, I believe much has also been overmade. A lot could be said about this. I will mention one piece of data and just one anecdote. Fairly recent findings from the Pew Forum throw more than a glass of cold water on the notion that the recent national spotlight on Mormonism from primarily the Mitt Romney candidacy have transformed the way the country understands the Mormon faith. In a poll conducted by the Pew Forum, a massive 82% of the respondents said that they learned virtually nothing or next to nothing about Mormons during the recent campaign. Other indicators in the same survey reveal relatively little national change in what Americans know today about Mormonism that they did not know 1 or 2 years ago. If a broad, reliable national survey, if these national surveys called for considerable modesty in assessing the impact of the Mormon movement on non-Mormons across the country, we might turn to any one of several prominent national anecdotes about the way Mormons did or did not feel caught up in their supposed moment. One of my favorite comes from a dispatch on the Hill Cumorah pageant carried in the New Republic this last summer. As Benjamin Soloway reports it, despite its missionary ambitions, in practice, the pageant is an insular LDS event, and it was unsurprising to discover that the Mormons who attended the spectacle were not closely attuned to outside attention. Hardly anyone at all was eager to discuss the spotlight that Mitt Romney's campaign had directed towards their religion. "I don't feel any different as a Mormon now than I did before," said R.J. Mattei, recently returned to Dallas from his mission in Salt Lake City. "But it's honestly hard to say. It's totally separate from anything I pay attention to. The Mormons I met at the pageant have decided to tune out all of the newfound attention, insisting almost unanimously that they do not feel substantially different about themselves or their place in society now that one of their co-religionists is on the precipice of becoming president." In asking Orson Scott Card, the author of this year's pageant, why the Mormons at the pageant seem so impervious to politics, I was told, "It's not that we don't care, it's that we don't care as Mormons." In the pageant parking lot, I saw license plates from 33 states, but not a single Romney bumper sticker. And yet, all of this said, I can't resist making the claim as a practicing Mormon, as opposed to a social scientist currently playing hooky in higher education administration, that in the aftermath of the Mormon moment, somehow the world does feel a little different, and I think will be different for Latter-day Saints at several levels. For now, I will just say something in terms of one of my areas of scholarly interest, presidential politics, where I do think a barrier of sorts has been broken. Almost a year ago today, I was invited to speak on a panel at the Wesley Theological Seminary about religion and politics in America, with an eye toward what was happening with the Romney campaign. At the time, I shared some unpublished data from a scholar at Vanderbilt who was carefully tracking and analyzing a variety of indicators of how religious issues were affecting the election. At that moment, roughly 29% of Americans indicated they would not vote for a Mormon candidate. These findings were consistent with a recent Gallup poll and also showed little movement from 2008 when the investigators posed the same question to an equally large sample of respondents. If you break the data down further by party, we see that Democrats are much less likely to vote for a Mormon than a Republican, with roughly 47% of self-identified Democrats indicating they would not vote for a Mormon, as opposed to 23% of self-identified Republicans. It is interesting to note here that in the same survey, Democrats were even more unlikely to support an evangelical candidate, with roughly 60% indicating they would not do so. Republicans, on the other hand, were far more likely to oppose a Muslim candidate, 77% so indicating. The numbers also suggest that between 2008 and 2012, there was a softening in the evangelical opposition to Romney. Certainly the prominence and vitriol of evangelical rhetoric against Romney was not as pronounced in 2012 as 2008. Although here, my colleagues at Vanderbilt have argued that evangelicals may have found a different way to express their opposition to Mitt Romney in something other than a bald-faced expression of religious difference. One battery of questions asked about perceptions of conservatism. Does true conservative mean supports small government, or supports individual liberty, or believes the right to life is the most important issue, etc.? One of those questions asked, does being a true conservative mean being a true Christian, being guided by Christian beliefs and practices? 62% of self-identified conservatives said yes, this is the case. Interestingly, self-described Mormon conservatives were less likely to agree with such a statement. In fact, 56% of Mormon conservatives showed the lowest level of support for such a statement out of all conservatives who indicated a religious affiliation. By contrast, evangelicals showed the highest levels of support for such a statement, indicating at a rate of 80% that a true conservative means being a true Christian guided by Christian beliefs and practices. And the highest of all were the Southern evangelicals, who come in at 82% in support of the statement. If, in fact, Mitt Romney's Mormonism was not as prominent a feature in the headline coverage of Republican primary election activity this cycle as it was last, what was a key feature was the cry among large swaths of Republican voters that Mitt Romney was not conservative enough. There surely are lots of reasons for such a hue and cry, some reasons perhaps more justified than others, but as these findings suggest, one of the things that may be happening is that certain Republican voters are now more carefully masking their religious antipathy for Mitt Romney under the cloak of him not being conservative enough, with the unstated conviction that being conservative means being Christian, which they are convinced Mitt the Mormon is not. One of the things this very admittedly brief tour of these numbers does is highlight just how complicated and nuanced any true picture will have to be of how the American electorate feels about a Mormon serving as president. But that noted, one gigantic fact remains. Mitt Romney almost won. Obama won 332 electoral votes to Romney's 206. In the popular vote, Obama took 50.6% to Romney's 47.8%. Compared to the truly razor-thin victory of, say, George Bush over Al Gore, this starts to sound like a rout. But by the general standards of 20th century elections, this was a very tight race. Between 1900 and 1999, only 5 of the 25 presidential elections were decided by fewer than 130 electoral votes, and only 3 had a popular vote margin smaller than the Obama-Romney contest. A shift of just a few 100,000 votes out of millions across a handful of battleground states, and the outcome would have been different. It was not that long ago, 2000 to be precise, that prominent public intellectuals could assert in print without any rebuttal that America was still ruled by a, quote, Protestant presidency, unquote. Despite the fact that John F. Kennedy supposedly broke the Catholic barrier over 50 years ago, and since then, presidential campaigns have become about as ecumenical as a Unitarian Seder, the only other Catholic to win the presidency was that darling, excuse me, we should have all done that at the beginning of our remarks here. The only other Catholic to win the presidency since that moment was the darling Josiah Bartlett, as played by Martin Sheen in The West Wing. As one observer has put it, the only way a Mormon could ever break through at this time period, the only way a Mormon could ever break through the Protestant grip on the White House was if he or she served first as vice president, quietly playing a fine second fiddle for 8 years before making a run for the top slot. Well, Mitt did not win, so maybe the observation still holds. But I don't think anyone would go to print with such a statement today. The issue is that though the real academic data is still being sifted, vetted, and published, the overwhelming sense of informed observers tend to agree that it was not Mitt's religion that cost him the election. It may have been a hurdle, it may have played a part, but it was not finally decisive. In that sense, I do believe Mitt Romney's campaign, while ultimately unsuccessful, was successful in clearing the path for future LDS candidates to run without nearly the same hurdles of reassuring a broad swath of Americans that a Mormon can be trusted with the highest office in the land. If this is true, it is not an insignificant alteration of American political culture. Thank you.
Okay, clearly, as you know, I am a reporter, so my sense of the Mormon moment or moments comes through my experience with as a reporter, both through my own work and reading everyone else's. I have watched the ebb and flow of interest in the Utah-based faith, different points. In the build-up to the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, I started getting phone calls from other reporters. I remember calls from Paris and from Germany, people asking me about Mormons and polygamy and alcohol, and asking me to give them a quick tutorial on 180 years of Mormon history. And that built up. The Olympics happened, it went away. Then in 2007, when Mitt Romney first announced his candidacy, by then I was a little more internet savvy. I put a Google alert out for any stories that mentioned Mitt Romney Mormon. And I started to get, back in 2007, 3 to 5 hits a week, stories popping up about Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney's stories always had the word Mormon in them. There was rarely a story that didn't have the word Mormon associated with his name. Then he didn't get the nomination. The Google alerts went down. Then 2 years ago, this month, I was at the opening of the Book of Mormon musical, sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, this New York audience is laughing extensively about stuff I write about all the time. And in an instant that night, I knew that that was going to be a successful show. Google alerts went up. This time, not about Mitt Romney, but just Mormon/Mormonism. I started getting more and more stories. Then Mitt Romney runs again. And this time, I started to get 8 to 10 Google alerts every single day. And then I started to get phone calls from media every day, every week. Not just the occasional polygamy questions, but all kinds of questions. What about baptism for the dead? Just think about this. I am trying to explain a concept like baptism for the dead to someone. English is not their first language. Religion is not their beat. They know nothing. They have no language or vocabulary about Mormonism, and they want me to provide that to them in 15 minutes. You could feel the interest in Mormonism sweeping across the media and a scramble to write the Mormon story. Then, when he was on the cover, as has been mentioned, he was on the cover of Time and Newsweek, USA Today, Business Week, New Yorker. New Yorker had a caricature of Mitt Romney riding a chauffeur-driven white horse. I thought it was pretty inside baseball, but clever. Then he lost. Now the Mormon/Mormonism Google alerts in my inbox slowed down to a handful a week, maybe, in good weeks. I haven't had a single reporter phone call since Mitt Romney gave his concession speech. To me, that says the Mormon moment is over, at least this Mormon moment. So this is my hypothesis. This is what I've seen. The news media gets interested in Mormonism primarily when it is connected to some national event, such as the Olympics or the presidential campaign. It is not the faith per se that is inherently intriguing, but something outside itself to which it is temporarily attached. There have been indeed Mormon moments, but not sustained interest. I disagree with those that think the LDS Church has just begun some golden age of media interest, which will continue to grow with each new temple, baptism, or public pronouncement. I don't see that. That's religion as it exists. That's not news. No, the church, I believe, will not be as invisible as it was before this all started. I agree with President Holland that something has changed. And if important news events touch it, like a second Olympics in Salt Lake City, which the city is looking at, or a believing Mormon grabs the national spotlight again, and we could talk about this, but I don't think John Huntsman would generate the same level of interest in his faith as Romney did. If such a thing happened, another candidate comes along, there will be a flurry of stories. But by and large, the church has returned to semi-obscurity, overshadowed by larger faiths and the next big story. In fact, I would call my remarks here the media's short attention span. Something has changed, but the moment has dissipated. So let me just run through some highlights of the media coverage as I saw it, particularly during Romney's run. Interesting thing happened in January 2008. He was at the height of he was in the primary. It looked like he was doing pretty well. I said, no other candidate really has ever been a, quote, pastor, as Mitt Romney was a bishop and an LDS stake president. And, of course, I happen to know a number of people in Boston who are in his Mormon congregation. So I thought, I should do a profile of him as a religious leader. What was he like? The only other person at that time was Mike Huckabee. I didn't have any contacts any special insight on him. So I decided to write about Mitt Romney. I wrote a big profile of Mitt Romney as a bishop and stake president, but then he dropped out a month later. And so I was interested that flash forward 4 years later, the New York Times, Sheryl Stolberg, the New York Times, Jason Horowitz, the Washington Post, Jessica Ravitz on CNN, then there was an LA Times piece, all of them sort of followed my story, wrote about him as a religious leader, used all my same sources, but told a really interesting story. And it was a little bit of a window on Mormonism through Mitt Romney that normally you don't get. And I think it was baffling to some reporters that he was both a successful businessman and a religious leader, and what was he like in that setting. The issues, of course, of whether evangelicals would vote for Mormonism and whether or not it was a cult, those played out bigger in the first campaign, culminating, as Brian mentioned, with just last October with Mitt Romney sitting next to Billy Graham. There were some interesting and, to me, amusing mistakes that were written about Mormonism. Jodi Kantor, of the New York Times, who wrote one of those profiles, generally a positive profile, but I did get a few laughs about it. She wrote that Deseret is a noun in LDS speak. She used it as a verb, to Deseret, and as opposed to an adjective suggesting industriousness. She described Mitt Romney as belting out, "What a friend we have in Jesus," where I was like, I don't think that's really a Mormon song, and Mitt Romney belting it out just doesn't work for me. She described white temple clothes as indicating an elevated state. I could have told her everyone in the temple wears white clothes, so there's no status involved in that. And Nephites and Lamanites are not in the Bible. Whoopi Goldberg on The View claimed that Mormons don't allow military service, which Ann Romney had to correct her on that. And my personal favorite mistake was the writer who said that if Mitt Romney fails to become president of the country, maybe he could be elected president of his church. Mitt Romney tithing and taxes stories created a lot of buzz. Business Week, when he first released some of his tax statements, there was this big donation to the LDS Church, which Mormons would know that was tithing. But there seemed to be some writing about it as if he was doing something sneaky and giving all that money to the church, like he was hiding it at the church. There were some big stories about LDS Church finances. The cover magazine of Business Week was particularly offensive to Mormons. It had a cover of John the Baptist giving the priesthood to Joseph Smith and to Oliver Cowdery with thought bubbles over their heads saying, "And thou shalt build a shopping mall, own stock in Burger King, and open a Polynesian theme park in Hawaii that shall be largely exempt from the frustrations of tax." That was pretty offensive to most Mormons, even though the story itself was fairly straightforward. The low point for me in the media coverage of this Mormon moment came in last March, about a year ago, when John Sweeney, a freelancer with the BBC, did a classic expose, complete with what is known as ambush journalism. He managed to get an interview with LDS Apostle Jeffrey Holland, and instead of asking the normal questions about the faith that Elder Holland was prepared to answer, he began questioning elements of the temple ceremony. Sweeney had led church officials to believe this would be a wide-ranging look at Mormonism, even got permission to film inside a Mormon chapel in Belmont, where Romney attends church, but it began and ended and was completely informed by former members out to expose the so-called secretive, deluded, dangerous, and cruel cult of Mormonism. That was kind of a low point in the Mormon moment. Then it was interesting to watch who the various reporters chose for sources, whether they would go to scholars, church members, church PR, former Mormons. Fascinating to watch the development of thoughtful commenters, some of whom are on this panel, as well as the random former Mormon. There's nothing wrong with former Mormons except that it's hard to generalize their experience to the whole church, and often a reporter had no idea that just because someone was once a Mormon doesn't make that person an expert. But the whole Mormon moment did serve to enlarge and expand outsiders' view of how diverse the church is, how, the fact that at the very end there was a kind of battle between Harry Reid and Mitt Romney, both active Mormons, one Democrat, one Republican, name-calling and on completely opposite sides of an issue, both active Mormons. I think that was a surprise to outsiders in this moment. And then there were some issues that arose that helped illuminate inside the church, issues about women, blacks, gays, some history. On balance, I would have to say the national media was, by and large, extremely fair to the church. Not all Mormons themselves felt that way. I think Mormons as a group are not used to being written about by the media, and so they're used to reading their own press, their own PR efforts. So it was, I think, a little surprising to be on the other side of that. This is what David Mason, a Mormon, wrote in the Washington Post right after the election was over. He says, quote, "From moment to moment, lo, these many months, I've been a dolt, a savage, a dupe, a bigot, a heretic, a criminal, a prude, even a communist, a traitor, a miscreant, a rogue, and a wastrel. And my protestations have meant that I'm also a liar. I found by way of the national press that I am not only Christian America's nightmare, but also a politically conservative ideologue who hates gay people, resents the federal government, wants all minorities to go home or to remain in poverty here, would put women back in the kitchen and the kitchen back in the church, and besides all that, would have dodged the draft had there been a war during the late 80s. All this because everyone is certain my religion says so. The outsiders have been sure they know me for a religious zealot, but for many of the insiders, I must be, and I'm an Obama supporter, he wrote, must be a former Mormon, one of the disaffected who left the church and is now only out to exercise my antagonism to a religion that cannot accommodate my ungodly politics because they are certain their religion says so. So he's expressing the kind of frustration that I think many Mormons felt during this onslaught of media coverage, despite the fact that by and large it was mostly fair. I think a lot of this came through op-ed pieces or columnists or bloggers, whatever. Let me just close by saying that it was a fascinating thing for me to watch as a reporter, to hear how people that I normally cover felt about how other reporters wrote about them, how they were being perceived. And let me just say, I am confident that, or hope that there'll be another Mormon moment while I'm still at my desk to write about it. Thank you.
In Mormon temples, in the rooms where marriages are performed, it's common for there to be two mirrors hanging directly opposite each other on either side of the room. Frequently, the officiator in a marriage ceremony will encourage the bride and groom to look at each other in these mirrors and see their doubled images infinitely reflected as a metaphor for eternity. But I can't be the only bride who got distracted by the awesome puffiness of my sleeves, it was the 80s, or that weird thing that was going on my hair and forgot to look at anything but myself. It turns out it's really tricky to look at someone besides yourself in a mirror. It strikes me in thinking about this Mormon moment and the many Mormon moments that have punctuated American cultural history, that Mormons and the Americans who are interested, intrigued, horrified, and puzzled by them often end up gazing at themselves rather than the other, and that more often than not, when we reach for a magnifying glass, we accidentally pick up a mirror. Take, for instance, the Mormon moment around the Smoot hearings in the early part of the 20th century. Observers were, as Kathleen Flake has said, grappling with big national questions. Here's Kathleen Flake, quote, "The Enlightenment wagered that a free press and rational open debate would lead to better decision-making, and people would exercise their franchise accordingly. But Mormonism seemed like a concentration of authority in a group of people impervious to the majority opinion. And not only were they impervious, but they appeared to follow one man who claimed to have divine revelation. This tapped into a tremendous American anxiety over people who put themselves above the law because God told them what the law was." So there, Mormons are standing in for everything that Americans have been worried about for a long time. And it also worked the other way when when Americans are feeling good about themselves. For instance, in the era when Mitt's father was governor and ran for president, Americans were less anxious generally. It was post-war, things were going well. They were eager to project the virtues of American capitalism and democracy onto George Romney. A successful Mormon became the embodiment of the good post-war citizen and businessman, and Mormons were frequently portrayed as a model minority. As Jan Ships puts it, during this time, quote, "almost as a reminder that the entire nation had not gone the way of the much maligned, pot-smoking, flag-burning counterculture, they regularly featured all sorts of images of Mormons as neat, modest, virtuous, family-loving, conservative, and patriotic people." After some bumps in the media in the 70s and 80s over Mormonism's racist priesthood restriction and anti-ERA activism, Ships asserts that the 90s saw the return of the model minority mode of description, capped off by the appearance of the extraordinarily charming and charismatic president of the church, Gordon B. Hinckley, in a 60 Minutes interview with Mike Wallace, where he famously assured viewers that Mormons were not weird. It's unsurprising, really, that Mormons become interesting at times when Americans are grappling with the limits of pluralism, pushing the boundaries of tolerance and diversity. Mormons are, pace President Hinckley, plenty weird to demonstrate Americans' tolerance for outlandish belief systems, but still as unthreatening to Americans' sense of the historic features of Americanness as apple pie or green jello and motherhood. It is, of course, exactly this dichotomy that has animated the examination of Mormons in this most recent Mormon moment. Let's call it the Parker Stone dilemma. Can one believe crazy things and still be nice? Or to frame it in a post-9/11 American context, how much religion is too much? At what point does religion become dangerous? Are Mormons nice enough to run for president, even if their religion is, per South Park, dumb, 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 dumb? Or does their niceness mask something sinister, as in John Krakauer's inventive account of the inherent violence of Mormonism? In a way, it's exactly the problem Kathleen Flake pointed to in the moment of the Smoot hearings. Can a country built on Enlightenment ideals of rationalism and liberal democracy, small l, small d, really tolerate the presence of people whose belief structures privilege the irrational and the undemocratic, revelation and obedience to authority? All of these tropes were played out in media coverage of the Romney campaign, Harold Bloom being the most notable proponent of the idea that Mormons are sinister in some medieval way and at the same time so brilliantly modern that they can leverage their capitalist prowess to buy up all of Florida or something like that. And Gary Wills relying on an undergraduate's explanation of Mormon belief in the inspired nature of the Constitution to suggest that Romney might introduce a, quote, fundamentalism of the law. Wills was at least gutsy enough to actually use the word fundamentalism, which many liberal critics of Romney left as a spooky hint without ever explicitly articulating the lurking suspicion and fear of religious irrationality. On the other side, there were lots and lots of nods to Romney's beautiful, monogamous family, his work ethic, his church service. Indeed, the dearth of skeletons in his closet made the family dog famous for riding on the roof, because that was apparently the worst thing that Mitt Romney had ever done besides paying tithing. Most of the time, these depictions worked hard to make Romney seem admirable, despite beliefs presumed to be so outre that his campaign tried never even to say the word Mormon. Occasionally, as in the article about smart Mormons that enjoyed a brief self-congratulatory flurry of social media sharing among Mormons a few weeks ago, someone might try to make the case that at least some Mormon beliefs, like the centrality of free agency, actually coincide with conservative American values in ways that make Mormons exceptionally good citizens. Still, like most of its precedents, this Mormon moment seems not to have answered the questions Americans would most like to answer by studying Mormons. They certainly haven't made Mormons better understood or more popular, at least not much. But I do think, along with Peggy and Matt, that this particular moment reveals something new in that the internal and external questions for Mormons are more similar than they've ever been. That is, the questions American observers are asking from the outside are more similar to the ones Mormons are confronting on the inside. This particular Mormon moment, if I say moment one more time, I won't say it at all for Lent after today, comes at a time when the Massian pendulum, swinging between Mormon distinctiveness and assimilation, was in motion already, and it seems to have acted to accelerate that pendulum swing. This is how I think it worked. Liberal reporters inclined to perhaps ever so slightly condescending generosity towards Mormons fell on the nice enough to fit in side of the Parker Stone dilemma, and they found sympathetic spokespersons, Joanna Brooks, Matt Bowman, Patrick Mason, Lisa Butterworth, Kathleen Flake, Richard Bushman, and others, who made Mormons sound pretty reasonable and even sometimes kind of charming. At the same time, Mormons themselves were working on this side of the equation with the I'm a Mormon campaign. Look, spunky feminists, working moms, faithful scholars, skateboarders, African-American Republican candidates for office in Utah. We're just like modern, liberal, rational, nice Americans. We're even learning to be nice to gay people. Reporters who wanted to tell the other story, the one about secretive temple rituals, enormous wealth and greed, homophobia, sexism, lingering racism, could also find spokespeople. A 2010 General Conference address that sounded as though it should have been given 50 years ago, a BYU professor's recapitulation of antiquated racist explanations for the priesthood ban, a giant luxury mall development built with church funds, and practically weekly examples of really unfortunate rhetoric about women and gender roles. If they had stuck around a little longer, they might have reported on the stunningly misogynist backlash against women who dared to wear dress pants to church, or several church leaders doubling down on the idea that women's place is in the home, not out lobbying for rights, and even publicly mocking women who express the pain that sexist practices in the church cause them in response to quiet, relatively quiet, social media agitation for women to be invited to say a prayer in General Conference. I want to argue that this is what makes the moment different from others. The question of who gets to tell the story of Mormonism is parallel to, rather than opposed or perpendicular to, the question of who gets to tell the story of Americanism, Americanness. We all want to know who will get to tell the story of an increasingly polarized country. We live not just in red states and blue states, but in segregated cyberspaces and cable news echo chambers. Mormons are not very different from their neighbors in this regard. Mormon Republicans are very Republican, and Mormon Democrats feel themselves a beleaguered minority. The media amplification of liberal and liberal-ish voices within Mormonism has made this contested narrative more visible to Mormons themselves, even as it has probably failed to make it apparent to outsiders. Mormons have realized or been shown that they are more American than they thought they were, even as Americans think they have been shown or have decided once again that Mormons are not quite as American as they think they are. Unfortunately, it may be that we've been looking at ourselves in the mirror long enough to go cross-eyed and not even be able to see ourselves anymore. My favorite moment of the whole Romney campaign was the abbreviated Mormon testimony meeting held on the stage of the Republican National Convention. As I often do in real testimony meetings, I found myself teary-eyed with empathy for these people whose politics I basically can't stand. A few days later, I found myself trying to convince a skeptical reporter that yes, those stories were real, and that there were probably at least dozens more that could have been told about Mitt Romney. I could never convince anyone that the most interesting thing about Mormons is that Mormon women in a couple of congregations, maybe a stake, given a week and a sufficient supply of cream of mushroom soup, could prepare enough sheer tonnage of casserole to feed the entire population of one of the smaller blue states, like, say, Massachusetts, where I live, which they regard as a hippie outpost where men are weak, women don't shave their legs, and all the children are baby socialists. And they would do it. They would do it. What Mormons know, even if they rarely articulate it, is that there are few straight lines to be drawn between belief and practice. Most people believe many reasonable things and a few nutty ones, and a set of shared practices forge connections that no amount of common belief can sustain. Mitt was at his most likable, and maybe his most nearly electable, on the night he described the way that a church with a big central bureaucracy manages to make charity possible and interdependence at a local level. Mormons and lots of their American Republican friends who believe that central bureaucracies are the devil's own handiwork just nodded and said amen. It turns out that we're not even very good at seeing ourselves in mirrors.
Go, you're late for class. I want to express my appreciation, and I'm sure all the other panelists feel the same way, to Brian Birch and Utah Valley University for putting this together. And I actually think, and this I will kind of touch upon a little bit later on, is a very appropriately Mormon way to think about this panel. The fact that Laurie Goodstein had to drop out was fortuitous because it has allowed the whole panel to come together in a fascinatingly integral way. We begin with President Matt Holland, who is able to present to you all some really excellent specific information about Mitt Romney's campaign. And then we move on to a consideration of journalism and how that campaign played out in the media through Peggy Fletcher Stack's commentary. And Christine Haglund is able to add to that a large amount of social and cultural history and perspective to provide some context to that journalistic and political detail. And then we're going to wrap up with Dr. Jim Faulkner, who's going to be able to situate it within a larger theological or religious context. This means there's actually no place for me. But he'd already paid for my flight, so I have to come up with something to say. So I'll see what I can do. I got some things wrong about the Mormon moment. Like my fellow panelists and many others, because I'm an academic, because I have some knowledge of American politics, because I'm involved in some Mormon studies discussions, I have, over the last year and a half, given a variety of presentations. I've been contacted by journalists. I've been asked for quotes. One of the things that I believed was that Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign would be much more of a repeat of his 2008 campaign than it actually was. I didn't think that he was going to be able to free himself from the strong cultural and religious and values-oriented rhetoric and campaign style that characterized his effort to win the Republican nomination in 2008. In fact, I was certain enough of this that I actually thought that John Huntsman had a bit of an advantage over Mitt Romney in the Republican campaign because he wasn't going to be so tied down. Obviously, I was wrong there. I was wrong not just in the way that the Romney campaign approached the American electorate throughout, not just the Republican primary campaign, but the general campaign, as well as just the way that electorate looked at their candidates and weighed their strengths, considered what they could bring to the table. Religion was not on as many people's minds. Values was not on as many people's minds, or at least not in the same way. And consequently, things played out a little bit differently than I imagined. I also imagined Mitt Romney would win, so I was wrong on that point as well. The Mormon moment that emerged from this electoral process was obviously, and this has been touched on earlier by other panelists, a whole lot more than Mitt Romney, a whole lot more than his involvement in a presidential race. It was a pop culture creation. It was a media creation. And there's been a lot of those media creations, and there will no doubt be many more. You can do a whole study of the history of Mormon moments, of these encounters between larger popular consciousness as mediated through newspapers, through the electronic media, and what Mormons themselves are doing or thinking at the time. Was this particular Mormon moment different? The suggestion is that yes, maybe not in the same way that a lot of us thought it would be different, but it did introduce a few new things. Speaking about it as a political scientist, I wonder about that. Can we look at Mitt Romney's candidacy and make any kind of comparisons to John F. Kennedy and Catholicism's place in America's political culture? Obviously, we can't not direct comparisons because John F. Kennedy won the presidency and Mitt Romney did not. You might say, therefore, that this particular campaign experience was kind of an Al Smith moment for the Mormons, Al Smith being the first Catholic candidate for the presidency back in 1928. But I would actually dissent from that, or at least I would have, at least until I heard some of the information and ideas that President Holland presented here. Al Smith in 1928 didn't win the presidency, but he brought a lot of Catholic, a lot of urban, a lot of blue-collar voters into the Democratic Party camp. The Democratic Party in the decades following the Civil War, having been oriented very much around a southern, Midwestern, agrarian, anti-Washington, populist kind of attitude. So Al Smith's candidacy began to lay the foundations for what came to be called the New Deal coalition that dominated the Democratic Party and led to many electoral successes for decades to come. Did Mitt Romney do anything like that? Well, no, because the Mormons were already there. They were very solidly placed within the Republican Party. The majority of American Mormons were. So he wasn't adding anything new to the coalition. However, President Holland makes me wonder if he might have really contributed to the development of America's political discourse kind of in reverse, in the sense that his presence as the Republican nominee led evangelical Protestant voters to rethink how they define conservatism, maybe solidify their sense that in the age of Obama and in the moment of the ascension of the Obama coalition, which is widely understood to be much more multiracial, much younger, much more secular, much less religious, much more female than previous electoral coalitions. In the face of that, maybe they think, well, we really need to hunker down and specify what we mean by conservatism. And it's possible that this, in the long run, is going to lead to some real changes in the sympathy that Mormon voters have long felt with the Republican Party and their ability to situate themselves within the Republican coalition. But that's just a thought that occurs to me on the basis of his comments. What about my own thoughts about the topic of the Mormon moment in general? As I said, it's primarily a media-driven phenomenon. It is not a phenomenon that had as its payoff the election of a first Mormon president. It had several other payoffs. A Mormon-themed musical swept the Tony Awards, so, you know, that's nice. And there were some other fun things that came out of it. But what can we get out of it substantively? What does it give us in terms of our own intellectual understanding of Mormons in America and what Mormons in America think about their own place within America? I gave a presentation at Sunstone Symposium this past summer. And while I was there, I got into a conversation with another presenter who happened to be a nephew of Mitt Romney, one of his major fundraisers here in the state of Utah, and somebody who, while certainly not within the inner circle of the campaign, somebody who knew its workings relatively well. I got to talking with him a little bit. Particularly, I wanted to talk to him about how he had described Mitt Romney in his presentation at the symposium as a very humble man. Well, for one thing, you cannot effectively run for president of the United States if you don't have an enormous amount of self-regard. A really humble, submissive, retiring individual can't be successful in this kind of campaign environment. So humble really doesn't quite work. And I talked with him a little bit about this, and we came to an agreement that what we're really getting at here was a particular quality that Mitt Romney exhibited very, very well, but a quality that is common throughout the American church. And that is a certain kind of internalized confidence, a reluctance to widely broadcast in an affirmative, aggressive way one's own beliefs, but nonetheless a serene commitment to those beliefs that in some way leaves one acting at a certain remove, at a certain distance, with a certain amount of disconnect from the pluralism going on around you. Let me shift gears here a moment and talk about something: America's civil religion. Now, this is a concept that is much discussed in people that take a look at American history, particularly at American political history. There's a lot of different ways to formulate the idea of a civil religion. But basically, those scholars that take seriously the idea agree that, broadly speaking, the United States is, if not a Christian nation in some sort of explicit sense, then at least a national culture that has been deeply shaped by Protestant Christianity, by certain principles of biblical morality that have been mediated through Protestant churches, and that consequently have developed particular ways of talking about truth and values, certain ways of affirming moral principles in public belief that draws upon these civil religious sources that, because they have been civilized in some particular sense, fit in well with America's liberal democratic culture. So, can Mormons fit in well with that civil religion? Now, the obvious answer is yeah, Of course they can. I mean, Catholics have, and Catholics in many ways were dealing historically with far greater obstacles to an acceptance, a theological acceptance of liberalism and democracy and the American way of life. If over time the Catholic Church could have found a way to interact with America's civil religious public, with its norms for talking about truth, for talking about morality, for talking about values, then surely Mormons can learn the same. It is interesting to note, though, that perhaps one can look at Mitt Romney and one can take a look at his particular, again, disconnect from certain ways of talking about values and certain ways of talking about religion, and highlight what might be the particular obstacles that American Mormons face in aligning themselves fully with America's civil religion. I draw for some information here upon a book by Robert Putnam and David Campbell called American Grace. It came out a few years ago. They are both superb scholars. The book is not about Mormonism per se, but it has an enormous amount of very relevant information about American Mormon life. Let me throw out to you some details that they came up with through their extensive survey research. 1, Mormons love Mormons more than any other religious group loves themselves. We like ourselves. I'm sorry, I'm identifying myself here as part of the in-group, which I suppose a good number of the people in this room are part of as well. We just really look highly upon our fellow Mormons because they're Mormon, like us. And so they're good, like us. We do this more than Jews. We do this more than mainline Protestants. We do this more than Catholics. Every religious group is, of course, going to have higher levels of sympathy for its own group, but Mormons are off the charts. We are also more homogenous. The American church is more homogenous than any other non-ethnic religious group in America. Latino Catholic parishes, Black Protestant churches, they outscore us in terms of racial and ethnic homogeneity. But in comparison with any other group, we are the most homogenous. We have the highest levels of acceptance of the idea that believers in other religions can get to heaven just as well as we can. We are at the same time, however, the highest levels of believers in the principle that there is only one true church and all others are wrong. And perhaps not coincidentally related to all this, Mormons are the most disliked Christian group in America. I mean, atheists, Muslims, and Buddhists, yeah, they're really hated. But out of Catholics, Protestants, Jews, anybody else that could associate themselves with the Judeo-Christian civil religion of America, we get the lowest scores in terms of likability. The Jews like us, but only a little bit over the baseline. All right? We're below the baseline for most others. This is my suspicion. In order to be a fully comfortable member of America's civil religion, and thus a fully comfortable participant in America's political culture, there is going to be a need for the Mormon Church and the Mormon people in America, one way or another, to learn how not to spend most of their time talking to themselves about how grateful they are that they have the truth. In the Catholic Church, this move away from a very authoritarian understanding of how one in a pluralistic society talks about morality and talks about values was primarily the result of top-down changes. Vatican II and other alterations within the Catholic Church that just streamlined and altered the way parishes operated and the way Catholics were educated in terms of how they lived out their commitments. I don't think that has happened within the Mormon Church yet. Now, maybe it is in fact happening, and it just hasn't been complete yet. I really appreciate Christine's comments, and I thought they were very, very insightful. about how in this particular Mormon moment you saw pressures within the American church for members of the church to present themselves as ordinary members of America's liberal order. And you similarly saw outside the church journalists that were looking at the church and finding representatives of the church who themselves could talk in that very mainstream liberal American order type way, a very civil religious type way. Now, it's possible that's the way that Mormons are going to be able to overcome that obstacle and fully fit in, not because of any change coming from the church office building in Salt Lake City, but because of pressures building from various different institutional and just idiosyncratic and personal factions within the different wards. Right now, however, I suspect that American Mormons are not quite there yet. I don't know how fair it is to look at Mitt Romney and suggest that in some way or another certain struggles he had in his campaign were reflective of this. But if there's any kind of conclusion that can be drawn from the Mormon moment, it's that if the moment has anything to do with negotiating with America's civil religion, then the American Mormon churches and the American Mormon culture's moment of the negotiation has only really just begun with Mitt Romney, and it's far from over. Thank you.
I hope it doesn't disappoint Russell, but I'm not going to situate the Mormon moment in a larger context of religions and theology. Since I don't know anything about that, I'm going to not talk about it. Before the election, I compared in print the Mormon moment and the way Mormons think about this as it's like a dorky guy in high school who wants to get a date to prom with the prettiest girl in school. And he really has hope, but it's unlikely to be fulfilled. Now, to be honest, I was hoping that he wouldn't get the date, not only for political reasons, but more so because I just wasn't really crazy about the earliest manifestations of the Mormon moment. And I was glad, in fact, that moment means short duration, and was hoping that it really did mean that. I didn't think that the national attention on us was going to be good for us. And I speak here obviously as one of us, in quotation marks us. But though Mitt Romney didn't get elected, what has been interesting to me is the degree to which there has continued to be some interest. I don't doubt that the press interest has dropped off. We're not a big deal. But it still seems to me that there may be some sense in which the dorky kid may have gotten a date. Now, I'm only relying in saying this on some experiences that I've had, and if the invitations that I get to talk about things are any indication, the moment may have extended a bit beyond the election at least. So let me give you some anecdotes of some of those experiences. And what I think those experiences suggest is not so much that people know more about us. Maybe they know no more about us than they did before, which I also think is almost certainly true and is likely to be true in general for a long time. But that shouldn't be shocking when you think about it and you ask yourself how much Mormons really know about Catholics, or how much Mormons really know about anybody, or how much any group knows about the other. We pretend to know, but we don't really know much about each other when it comes to religious beliefs. We have some caricatures that we carry around in our head, labeled Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim, and so on, and we defer to those caricatures as much as anything else. And Mormons ought not to be surprised that that's the way in which people think about them. But as I said, let me give you some anecdotes, but let me preface those anecdotes by recognizing that I am not a person who believes that the state of universities and colleges somehow reflects the state of the nation as a whole. I don't deceive myself into thinking that we are representative of much of anything except ourselves. It's a serious mistake that academics make think that, and I'm hoping not to make it. But the only experiences I have are academic experiences, so I will use those. I first came to thinking about any of this, really, in 1995-96. I was a visiting professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and I was lecturing there on some topics that I was working on in community and philosophy of community, and some work on Heidegger, things like that. Things not particularly related, at least not directly related to my religious beliefs. But everybody on the faculty of philosophy where I was knew that I was a Mormon. And so one night I was invited by the bishop, the local bishop, the head of the School of Theology, and some of the faculty of theology and those from the faculty of philosophy to come to dinner at the bishop's house where we would talk about Mormonism. Now, had I been still a missionary of 19 or 20, I might have thought that was exciting. I wasn't that excited because I didn't have any idea what I was going to say. I didn't have that much in my, background to talk about these things. I didn't know Mormon history. I don't know Mormon history very well. A lot of things about this sort of stuff I didn't know well. I know better now, but I didn't know then. I went to dinner. We talked for an hour or more. We had a good conversation over a very nice dinner. But one of the things that amazed the bishop was he would ask me something, and I would preface that by saying, well, I believe, or some Mormons believe, or, I'd give that kind of explanation. And just before we left, he said, Mr. Faulkner, you need to go back to Salt Lake City. And when you get there, you need to go to the elders of your church and tell them that if they don't get themselves a theology, the church will die. That made me begin to think about this whole issue of theology. I tried to assure him that we probably would survive, especially without my advice to Salt Lake City. And so far, we have survived without my advice to Salt Lake City. But that made me begin to think about some of these issues and about on the one side, the ignorance that others have about Mormons, and on the other hand, what Mormons might do about some of that ignorance. Now, that has stayed more or less a kind of academic, write an article here or there interest and do some things here or there until the election, when some people would ask me questions about Mitt Romney or other kinds of things. Most of the time, though, until the election, my experience had been that I would go to a conference and I would be talking with colleagues, some of whom I've known for 20 or 25 years, and one of them would say something and I would explain, he'd ask me, about coffee or whatever it is that came up at the dinner table, and I would explain what Mormons believe about that. And he would have two reactions. One of them is, you can't really be a Mormon, right? And the reasoning was, and this was never made explicit, but it was pretty obvious. His reasoning was, you're smart enough to get along with us here. You're not the brightest bulb in the room, but you're smart enough to be turned on at least. You're here with us. How could you also be a Mormon? And that has been a sub-theme for many years. During the Mormon moment, though, this became more and more of an explicit theme. I've been invited, for example, to deliver a lecture in the Northwest next month, and the person who asked me was quite explicit about it. He said, our faculty wants to know how any smart person could be a Mormon. I tried to overcome the implicit insult there, or explicit insult, and to talk about that with him, about what I could say that would respond to their needs. I had to say I was sort of pleased that someone finally outside of my family and close friends had said, gee, Jim, we think you're smart. But in the context, it wasn't so much of a compliment anyway. But that has been the kind of experience that I think that I keep encountering among university types. There's an interest in Mormonism and a kind of incredulity that Mormons are not all ignorant hicks of some kind or another. Now, there's the same incredulity about evangelicals, and I can assure there may be Mormons who have that same stereotype in mind. I can assure you that there are very smart evangelicals. I'm bringing one to BYU in about the middle of April to speak. There are very smart Catholics. You don't have to be a Mormon to be smart. You don't have to be a believer to be smart. Smart and religious, I don't know what the correlation is between smart and religious, but I'm pretty sure it's not direct. But this is one of the kinds of things that's happened. And on the international scene, it's surprising to me the degree to which there is more general interest in Mormonism. In December, there was a conference in Bordeaux, and that was a conference on Mormonism. The most surprising thing to me there was that there were a number of French and Belgian and British thinkers who were taking Mormonism very seriously and writing about it, thinking about it, trying to figure us out, and most of whom knew us very, very well, much better than the average Mormon knows us. So it was I wrote a column on that, calling it French kangaroos. You don't expect to see kangaroos in France. I didn't expect to see people who really understand Mormonism well and are well acquainted with our history and our beliefs, talking to each other, not needing to have some Mormon imprimatur to hold their meeting and holding this very scholarly conference on Mormonism. There's another such conference being sponsored in Brussels by the Free University of Brussels in May. And again, the number of people coming here, I'm paying more attention this time, the number of people coming to this conference from other places that I wouldn't expect them, other countries from around Europe and some from the United States, is surprising. It's also been pleasant to me to discover, I have gone to a conference every October in Baylor for some years. It's a good conference that they hold, but most of the time my reception has been mildly chilly. Not rude, but mildly chilly. And this year I was received quite warmly, and I have to say it must be because of Mitt Romney. I should write him a thank you note. It must be because there's been this change of attitude and interest. It isn't like these people in Baylor, the Baptists of Baylor, think that Mormons have all of a sudden gone mainstream and are no longer a cult. But it is because they have decided at least to take us more seriously and that we can sit at the table and talk. So that's been very pleasant to me. The conclusion that I would come to then is that this is what I began with, and that is that I'm not sure that the moment would last. I'm actually hoping it won't last. It shouldn't last as a news item. I'm not so sure that we can expect to see a lot of people increase their knowledge of Mormonism so that you can stop people and they are conversant in Mormon belief. That would be very strange. But I am sure that there's more interest and there is more openness to talking to Mormons about Mormonism, and I'm grateful for that. So I think that in that sense, there's been a good effect of the Mormon moment, even though it is, in some sense, over. Thank you.
Well, thank you, panelists. We have about 30 minutes left. We have until 2 o'clock for discussion and Q&A. There should be roving mics coming, so please, if you could, wait for the microphone to arrive so that we can capture your question on our videotape. I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask the first question, and I was thinking as Jim was speaking about an experience that happened to me a few years ago, shortly after President Hinckley's interview that Christine referenced about where he was famously quoted as Mormons not being weird. A reporter from the Deseret News called and wanted me to comment on this notion of Mormon distinctiveness, how it is that Mormons think of themselves as being distinct versus assimilated. And one of the downsides of getting interviewed by a reporter on the telephone is that you oftentimes have to think of answers real time, and you know that if you say something poorly, that it could hit the front page and poorly reflect upon what you say. That wasn't the case this time, fortunately. But what I tried to do with the reporter, it was a very interesting conversation. I tried to play on this notion that Mormons don't think of themselves as weird, but they do think of themselves as peculiar, because there's a well-known, Christianity as a peculiar religion, and Mormons as well take on that that term to refer to themselves. So I was playing with this notion, what does it mean to be peculiar but not weird? And this seemed to really resonate with the reporter, and he used it as the basis of his story. But ever since that conversation, it got me thinking about this notion of assimilation versus distinctiveness, and the ways in which Latter-day Saints think of themselves in terms of these categories. Because as many of you know, persecution lies at the heart of Mormon narratives. The idea that Latter-day Saints are persecuted by a broader society, goes deep not only in our history but in our consciousness as well. And so here's my question to the panelists. To the extent that Latter-day Saints enter the mainstream and become acceptable and become another Christian denomination alongside others, at least increasingly so, to what extent does that disrupt the Mormon narrative of being a persecuted people, and that itself serving as evidence that they are the true people of God? So I'll throw that out, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Are you talking to the mic?
Yes,
Do these
yes,
work?
please, yes.
Do these work?
And please keep talking to it closely. So
Okay. I would respond to Brian's comment by making use of the terms that he uses, peculiar versus weird. Obviously, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a global church, but the bulk of the money in the church, the bulk of the leadership class in the church is still American, and so the narratives come out of America. Of course, our history is American, and so that just reemphasizes the idea that the narratives are American, and in America there's this history of persecution. If you're persecuted, then obviously you're being pushed out of something. We were literally pushed out of something, pushed out of Illinois. I think metaphorically you're pushed out as well. You're pushed out of the civil religion. You're pushed out of Christianity. You're pushed out of normal American life. You're a foreigner. You're weird. You don't belong. If we hold tightly to the persecution narrative, then I don't know how we can stop wanting to stay weird. Now, we could become peculiar, and we could stick with peculiar, because that just indicates, kind of a set of distinctiveness that sets you apart from the other people within the larger whole that you're part of. Catholics are peculiar. Southern Baptists are peculiar. The Eastern Orthodox are peculiar, but they're all part of the Christian whole. If we truly want not to be weird, then I think we have to content ourselves with being peculiar, which means that we're maybe a little bit odd in the larger whole, just as everybody else is a little bit odd within the larger whole, but we can't continue to insist that we're not part of that larger whole anymore, which means that we can't make a big deal about having been pushed out of it any longer.
I guess I agree and disagree with Russell. I agree that peculiars are probably a better way to think about this weirdness than, what was the other word? Than the other word. Yeah. Weird. Yeah, peculiar is a better way to think about it than weird. But I don't think that Mormonism needs the persecution to continue in order to work. Though I do think that the narrative of the early persecution is an important part of, it serves a kind of mythic narrative status like the stories of the Old Testament serve for Jews and others. We need this history, and we need to remember that history as Mormons to continue the community, but it doesn't follow from that you always so you have to have a narrative of persecution, but it doesn't have to be a narrative in which the persecution is ongoing.
I completely disagree with both Jim and Russell. I think Mormons have shown themselves perfectly capable of adducing Rodney Stark's projections of Mormon growth and success as evidence of their chosenness. And so I think that narrative is so strong that it can persist either way, but either because Mormons are growing and successful or because Mormons are persecuted. Both things are evidence of their chosenness. Yay. That goes with that high self-regard.
Perhaps I will pursue a middle road here. I wonder if another category would help here at some level, as I do think there's something very real and germane to the question about persecution, and are we moving into a new era, with or without persecution. There's a certain register in the Book of Mormon about the theme of wilderness. It kind of opens on that note, a family going into the wilderness narratively, a family going into a wilderness chronologically, and then a people going out of a wilderness, across the sea, into a promised land, back into a wilderness. I mean, it's just replete through the whole idea, and that's at some level for Latter-day Saints who are trying to follow a certain Book of Mormon injunction to liken an ancient scripture unto themselves. That's not the hardest thing to do, though we no longer live in kind of physical wildernesses. We did early on, and since then we've been in kind of a cultural, social wilderness at some level. I wonder if we might say at one hand that coming out of our wilderness, so to speak, and I do think there's something to that in this Mormon moment, that again, it can be overstated, it could be overwrought at some level, but that I think there is this sense that we're not as obscure as we used to be, we're not as off to the side as we used to be, we are more in it, if you will, therefore out of the wilderness, but being out of the wilderness doesn't necessarily mean that the persecution will end. There can be at once success and growth and dynamism and visibility, even as there will continue to be, I think, some persecution for positions taken, beliefs held, and it's just in a slightly different register of visibility.
Just as a follow-on to Christine's comment about both the persecution and the success as being evidence of Mormon truthfulness, when I was invited to go to BYU to talk about the Mormon moment, it was this theme that I had in mind that I wanted to talk about, and I expressed it in terms of two metaphors in Latter-day Saint culture and in Christian and Jewish culture more broadly. And that's this metaphor of the stone, which of course comes from the book of Daniel, in which you have this idea that the kingdom of God is going to roll forward unabated by the hand of God. So you have this triumphalist notion that nothing can stop the work, and that goes very deep in Mormon missionary culture. But you also have this other metaphor of the leaven, where the notion of the people of God as a minority that is intended to leaven the rest of society and will perpetually remain a minority, and that is their role. That's, of course, a very important Jewish concept of self. I think that my sense is that Latter-day Saints are wrestling between those two metaphors, not necessarily explicitly, but there's a certain level of discomfort, I think, in terms of how to think about the development and the attention paid to Mormonism within the broader society. So with that, questions? There's one over here.
I just wanted to ask the panelists, if I can scroll down to where I wrote the question. The Mormon moment, like many things Mormon, tends to skew really, really male. And I'm curious what you saw happening with Mormon women during the Mormon moment, and if you think there will be increased visibility for Mormon women's issues and Mormon feminism going forward from here.
Let me just say, I was surprised how little attention there were to Mormon feminist issues during the Romney campaign, and yet they seem to have exploded since then, and that kind of is an interesting dichotomy. as a journalist, I do see a lot more interest in Mormon women's issues going forward. I think it's really, for some reason, it's coming together, it seems to be, from all kinds of different arenas and kind of exploding on the scene, maybe as if the Romney campaign took all the focus away and now it's erupting. I don't know, I'm kind of seeing that happen just from a coverage point of view. Go, Christine.
Oh, no, the only thing I was thinking is that, I mean, that fits, Peggy, what you just said there fits in very well with how we understand campaigns to operate in terms of driving narratives. You know, ultimately, for the great majority of voters, or at least for a decisive majority of voters, the contest between Obama and Romney was an argument over government. It was an argument over how one identifies with, you know, the role of government in America and American culture and things like that. Neither candidate spent a whole lot of time talking about culture war issues and the treatment of women in our economy, in our politics, under law, in our churches. That's a culture issue. And so as long as that campaign was going on, they were always looking to connect their stories to that narrative line. Now that the campaign was over, they had all this information, they had all this insight into the church, and no longer a controlling narrative for it. So there's a lot more opportunity for them to say, well, actually, let's talk about these women over here, or talk about those women over there. We couldn't find a way to do that prior to November 2nd, but now we have a way to do it because we're not locked in any longer.
I think the Romney campaign provided the occasion for more of these issues to be brought out. You know, for example, a lot more attention was paid to Mormon Democrats than otherwise would have been paid in any presidential election. And as it, you know, as it relates to women, as I recall, and Peggy can correct me if I'm wrong, when there was the call among Mormon feminists to wear dress pants to church, that ran in the New York Times. There was a New York Times story about that. Yeah, but would the story have been written had that not been an elevated part of the American discourse? I don't know. It kind of goes back to your comment about the decline in attention, but yeah, I just don't think that it would have registered otherwise.
I think to the extent that anybody stays interested in Mormonism at all, they will be interested in Mormon women, partly because that's where the tension is within Mormonism. Mormon women are eager to argue with each other, apparently, at least online and visibly. So, so there's it's sort of an easy reporting thing to do, right? To go to feminist Mormon housewives and see what they're saying and then read the conservative comments, and you've got a story with some conflict and maybe some resolution and interesting characters. I hope Molly Ringwald plays me in the movie. But it's inevitable that perceptive reporters and observers will come to these family gender issues because family and gender roles and homosexuality, slightly misunderstood as a problem of performance of gender rather than orientation, have become the boundary maintenance issues for Mormon culture with the wider American culture. That's where we really think we're drawing the line between us and them in the early 21st century. So I think it's inevitable that people who are smart about Mormons will look there.
Other questions? Yes, there's one right down in the middle here, Daniel.
Hi, first of all, I've really enjoyed all of your views and appreciate the opportunity and the honor to be here in your presence. I'd like to kind of propose, ask, and consider the panelists to, if you had one word that you could choose instead of peculiar or weird, as referencing to Mormons, what word would you choose? And I'm hoping that it would spark maybe a change not just here in our presence, but something that can continue on past today, in how others view Mormons and how we view ourselves.
Peggy and I looked at each other and we both blurted out the word distinctive, because it is an interesting word, but it is a safe word in comparison to, say, weird. And so, for example, when I'm writing up conference descriptions so as to be, inclusive but interesting, the word distinctive is one of my favorites to refer to Mormonism. And there are interesting issues surrounding that. For example, the debate among Christians regarding how to understand Mormonism vis-a-vis other Christian faiths. So you famously have President Hinckley saying, well, of course we're Christians, it's in our name. That's a well-known statement. But then you have other Christian leaders saying things like, well, I don't think that Mormonism is Christian necessarily, but they are a fourth Abrahamic tradition. And so there was a sense of respect and respectability in putting Mormonism alongside Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but yet, as Russell pointed out, pushed to the outside and to the margins. So even these words really have potent meaning when you start talking about them, especially within the Christian community.
I'd sign on for distinctive if we can't go with handsome. So that's,
Well, I think it may be because my children are all adults and speak of me with some irreverence, but I'm not at all, I have no trouble with either weird or peculiar. I like peculiar better than weird, but especially because it has etymological roots that are better than just weird. But I guess I think it's not a problem for us to be weird. It's not a problem for us to be peculiar. Distinctive works, that's okay. If reporters want to use that word, I'm fine with it. But I am quite happy to accept the fact that I am weird.
I'm okay with weird too, but I'm not as weird as Jim. I wish we would, that people might use the word complicated, just because it might lead to sort of a thicker description of what Mormons are like. Because we are weird, but we're weird in different and interesting ways, even amongst each other.
Conflicted for basically the same reason that Christine chose complicated. I think that there are a lot of American Mormons that have, in a way, completely unconscious, completely, internalized, have accepted American capitalism, have accepted American democracy, have accepted American liberal norms, have accommodated themselves to being an ordinary citizen of a post-industrial, capitalist, modern, democratic state. And yet, they think that they ought to be weird in some way. They ought to be different. They ought to be of this world. They ought to be in this world, but not of it. And then there are other American Mormons who say, well, why can't we be of it, since we already agree with so much of it anyway? I think that conflict has been going on for a while. I think possibly the Mitt Romney campaign has highlighted it, sharpened it. I don't think it's over.
Other questions? Does somebody have the microphone already? Okay, there's a question now.
All right, thank you. So I'm very interested in this interplay between American Mormonism and international Mormonism, perhaps how the Mormon moment has kind of affected the global church, or at least global perceptions of the church. And specifically, more recently, I have a quick anecdote, which is with the Wear Pants to Church Sunday. It was created quite a furor locally and even in California, where my family is from. But when I talked to my German roommate about it, he said it was completely inconsequential. And when his mother heard about it, she didn't think it meant anything because that wasn't an issue in her ward. So how do these issues that we've spoken about ad nauseum in our own echo chambers and to our own mirrors, funhouse or real mirrors, whatever they might be, reflect on kind of the broader sphere of Mormonism, and how does perhaps internet niche culture and the bloggernacle play into that?
I think it's really difficult to know the answer to that question Again, it's merely anecdotal, but my anecdotal experience is much like yours. For the most part, a lot of the issues that Mormons in the United States take very seriously, Mormons outside the United States are either unaware of or don't care about, especially these kinds of cultural issues that we think are so important. But how much did the Romney campaign affect their relationship with broader culture is hard to say. I know in France it's not necessarily a good thing to be connected to Romney. It doesn't have the best image among French people. And so I would bet that French Mormons were not that excited about having an American presidential candidate. But as I say, I think it's going to vary a lot from country to country. And I think for the most part, it doesn't make much difference.
I would just add, it does seem to me, I think your question implies it, that the so-called Mormon moment, to the extent it is a Mormon moment, is a distinctly American moment. I mean, it's American politics, it's American culture. It's hard for me to conceive of how that could even translate into, say, a European setting. If you had a French-English person or French person running for office, I think it would play out very differently. Now, clearly there's going to be some overspray, if you will, given the role and influence of America in the world, and the world watches American elections. But it seems to me very much a secondary or even tertiary kind of influence or force, and the more, for me, interesting questions are, not to say it's not an interesting question, but the more significant impact is how it's affecting American audiences and the American side of the church.
Let me just say, I am on the board of the International Association of Religion Journalists, which met in Italy last year. My colleagues, 22 religion writers from 22 countries, every one of them was very interested in Mormonism and Mitt Romney, that connection, and how it might play out in their countries. I ended up writing a joint article with a Serbian journalist, told me a fascinating story about how the Serbian Orthodox Church essentially runs Serbia, very low opinion of outsiders, particularly Mormons, and yet takes a lot of money from the American government. So if a Mormon were the US president, what would that bode for their financial support from the US? So they thought. I think some of those cultural issues you talk about with women wearing pants or whatever, that is certainly an American cultural convention that doesn't affect women, Mormon women, pretty much anywhere else but the US, and maybe even the Western US. But American politics that are associated with Mormonism definitely has its impact everywhere else in the world. My colleagues in Israel and in Amman, Jordan, very interested in Mitt Romney and his Mormon theology. So I don't think you can say that it was irrelevant as a worldwide issue. I also got calls, as I said, from Paris, from Germany, all these people very, very, very interested. They largely live in a secular country, so they had no clue about Mormonism and how to figure that out. They were quite interested in it.
We have time for one more brief question. Looks like this row is popular. Yeah, please, thank you.
I'm actually having a little bit of trouble trying to articulate my question, but I was a little bit surprised by the initial portrayal of Mormons on that Rock Center program about the industrious, big corporate success, and it just didn't really resonate with me and my experience, I guess. So I'm just kind of wanting to hear what you think about that portrayal and how much that really is the case. I don't know.
Well, I mean,
the successful capitalist
right. Well,
Mormon.
Part of that again had to have been a function of the overriding narrative of the campaign. I mean, economic issues. What are you going to do about the economic problems? Are you going to use government solutions or market-based solutions? And here comes Mitt Romney with his experience with finance capitalism and hammering home again and again and again and again and again and again and again that he's going to be a business creator, a job creator. And so you talk about Mormonism. Well, maybe the first thing you talk about is how do Mormons do in taking care of these kind of economic needs? But there has also been a long history in the American media of taking a look at the church's welfare programs and highlighting it as an exemplary kind of faith-based organization or faith-based welfare operation. I mean, this goes back to all the way when President Ezra Taft Benson was Secretary of Agriculture. Time magazine did features on the church welfare program. I wasn't surprised at all that they started out talking about that. I think there were a lot of different reasons why they would choose to focus on that before they got on to other things.
Isn't there a bus that will pick people up at the airport and take them to Welfare Square and other Mormon sites? It's the first thing people see, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, in terms of the national media, there were a couple of very significant articles written about Mormon corporate success stories. One of them was by Alan Wolf. And it's just interesting how these social networks operate, because oftentimes intellectuals and journalists and other public intellectual types interact with very well-known Latter-day Saints who embody this notion of Mormon success. And so I recall the Alan Wolf story focusing on a handful of Mormon corporate titans, such as the Marriotts and others, and making the point that there's a kind of embodiment of Mormon corporate industriousness that lies at the heart of Mormonism. And certainly there is something to be said for that, but it also has to do with sometimes the narrow social corridors within which people who commentate on culture work. And, for example, Wolf is a professor of religion at Boston University, and thus he's right in the middle of, the intellectual center of gravity in the country. And of course he's going to interact with people like Clayton Christensen at Harvard and other very well-known, very public, very successful model Mormons such as Mitt Romney.
Yeah, I'll just anecdotally, Clayton is Alan Wolf's only close Mormon friend. So that's, where that focus comes from, I think. And he's Boston College, not Boston University. He'd be offended.
My apologies. I should be offended.